Hello and welcome to the next installment of Lexington Books Anthropology of Tourism, Heritage, Mobility, and Societies author conversation series. That's a big mouthful, but we get through it, you know. I'm your host. I'm also the series editor of the Anthropology of Tourism, Heritage, Mobility, and Society. My name is Michael DiGiovine. I'm professor of anthropology here at Westchester University in Pennsylvania, United States. I'm also director of the Museum of Anthropology and Archaeology and the head of the Anthropology of Tourism Interest Group at the American Anthropological Association. And so it's always wonderful and it's fun for me to chat with different authors who have contributed to our book series. The series is great, if I could say so myself. We have almost 20 books in the about 4 or 5 years that we've been operating. They're all very pretty, and they're all on the shelf over here. And they really cover a wide range of topics, from health and well-being, and we'll be talking about a dimension of that today, to methodology, ethnography of tourism, for example, is our first conversation, capoeira, pilgrimage, and so on. You don't have to be an anthropologist to read it, obviously, and a hallmark of anthropology is trying to make a very accessible and readable narrative. But you also don't have to be, if anybody's in the audience that are thinking of publishing a book on tourism in the series, you really don't have to be an anthropologist either. You just have to kind of share anthropology's interest in kind of qualitative research in some way, and its engagement with a holistic and comprehensive approach towards research. And I'm really pleased to have such a really holistic approach to medical tourism represented here today with Kristen Smith from University of Melbourne in Australia, who's a medical anthropologist as well. And thanks so much, Kristen, for staying awake. It's the other side of the world here, and it's daytime here and morning in the US, and it's really late at night by you. So thanks for zooming in.
My pleasure.
Yeah. So, I guess I should ask, so you would define yourself as more of a medical anthropologist than maybe an anthropologist of tourism or something like that, perhaps, or?
Yeah, very much so. So I guess my training in my undergrad, I did a Bachelor of Arts that was I had a major in anthropology, but specialized in medical anthropology. Also sort of did minors in development, the anthropology of development, but came to tourism studies sort of through a variety of different ways, and always quite enjoyed the theory of scholars of anthropology of tourism. So when I came across my topic area, which I can talk about and came into, but through, most of us don't go there on a linear path, but really sort of got heavily involved in, I guess, dissecting initially the terminology of medical tourism itself, but we can get into that later. But I was just wondering if you'd indulge me. Here in Australia, whenever we start webinars or meetings of any time, we always start with an acknowledgement of country. So if you wouldn't mind if I did that.
Yes, please.
Yeah, so I'd like to acknowledge the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, who are the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander traditional custodians on the land which I'm on today, which is in Naarm, which most of you would probably know as the city of Melbourne in Australia. So I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and the place of Indigenous knowledge in the academy and beyond. So I recognise and respect their cultural heritage, beliefs and relationship with the land, which continue to be important to the Kulin Nation today. I'd also like to extend my acknowledgement to the traditional custodians of the various lands on which those of you online are joining us today, and extend my respect to any other Indigenous people joining us as well.
And thank you. And I too, we're working on a land acknowledgement here at Westchester University, but we are, as I'm sure many of our students know, we're on the land of formerly known as Lenape-Hocking, for the Lenape Indians and Native Americans, who are mainly now called the Munsee up in Wisconsin, and the Lenape or Delaware tribe of Indians in Oklahoma. So we do acknowledge that as well. So thank you. Thanks for reminding me. We don't have that tradition yet, but it is growing here in the US, which is a good thing.
Yeah, okay. Excellent.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very standard in Australia now, which is
Right.
a
And
good
in
thing.
Canada too, and other areas as well, which is great.
Yeah.
And you were saying, not to go off topic, but while we're on this, I mean, you do also do some work in studying Indigenous peoples, correct?
Yeah. So the majority of my projects and research in probably the last 5 years or so, maybe up to 10 years, have focused on Indigenous Australians. So I've been working with communities all across Australia, particularly a lot of communities in remote communities up in Northern Australia, across the northern jurisdictions. So I do a lot of work looking at focuses such as, alcohol issues in communities. We've been looking at family violence, but also I've started to do a bit of work. I've been appointed as the research director of the Australian Indigenous Data Network, which might seem a bit strange as an anthropologist to some people out there, but I'm bringing our anthropology approach to data across Australia in terms of Indigenous data. We're building national infrastructure and all sorts of weird and wonderful things.
That's really wonderful. I mean, I think there's a lot, obviously, to say that anthropologists have to say, especially in our collaborations with Indigenous peoples. Certainly in the U.S., anthropologists have converted from, let's say, those who really, made their careers off the backs of, let's not say grave robbing, but certainly by studying and divesting, to today, really working as best we can as advocates for Indigenous peoples here in the U.S. So it's great to have somebody, but like we were talking about before, and we're going all over the place here, but it is important to bring that qualitative as well as quantitative kind of data sensibilities to to government policy of any kind. I mean, it's so quantitative driven, but anthropologists really, I think, have something to say that's more than, we would always say it when I do museum consulting, that it was we dimensionalize the data. We add depth and 3D to numbers, but really, I mean, you get so much more than, it's more than that, right?
Yeah, I think I mentioned to you before, Michael, usually in the majority of the research that I do, I use the quantitative data to support the qualitative, not the other way around.
Right.
So, whether that be contextualizing whether it be the political economy of what you're doing, or whether it's population or demographics, which you'll find very much embedded in my book, just to give it another dimension to the qualitative work. And also, when you've got your participants or your informants in your study saying one thing, sometimes it's good to sort of have a look at the quant data, because often the data is very bad, and it's not interrogated very well. So anyway, that's
we talk about that all the time. I mean, I'm a big apologist for qualitative data, and in my classes, my methods class and everything, I say, why is it that the numbers seem to lie, right? They say they're going to do one thing and then they do another else. It's not the numbers that lie, but it is a host of really deep motivations, and aspirational answers, things like that. I mean, people lie, people are changing, or not presenting the fullness, and you really need to be there in order to understand really what the context is to some of those questions, but one of the things that I really like about this book, just to give a little plug for it as well, is that I think you do very nicely and rather uniquely for the series, melding or mixing, giving a very holistic and mixed method approach. There are a lot of numbers, there is a lot of quantitative data in this. I remember it was the lockdown when I was reading this manuscript, and I'm like going through it, and there's like a lot of numbers, and my eyes are hurting from reading the Zoom all the time and everything. But and that really stuck with me though, and I said, this is unique for what we're doing here in this series, and I think it's a very good. And the students picked it up too. They gave very good presentations this week on your book, and I think it was helpful to have kind of that data, right? That quantitative data to really give the big picture perspective of some of the things that you're discussing. And I do urge people to really do that more often. Really, the two go together. They shouldn't fight with each other.
That's right. It's a false dichotomy, I would say. A false dichotomy.
Yes, that's true. It is a false.
Yeah. So ultimately, I find that particularly when you're sort of looking at I guess from the local through to the international scale, it just gives another way of looking at when you're doing policy analysis or critical analysis of policy, to really unpack and I guess pull apart and make sense of what is going on in different scenarios. So in this book, I guess I use that, as you said, I do use quite a few statistics. So I did a lot of work. Look, I've been working on this stuff since probably back in 2006 when I started a minor thesis for my master's, looking at, I guess, more so commercialization of healthcare systems and in particular India's healthcare system over time. So I did quite a bit of data analysis, drawing on, well, India's been very, very good at collecting data for a very long time and better than most countries across the world. So did a lot of deep dives, but because population is so huge, the data is often very messy and hard to sort of unpack, and it gets reported in particular ways. So you really have to do your own analysis of the raw data to actually get the picture that you're looking for, that won't necessarily be reported in, you know, the 10% of this or the 90% of that. So that's sort of the way that I work with that.
Sure. And I mean, you get, like you said, India is such a huge country. I mean, you did have a statistic in the book. I remember, now I can't remember what percentage, what is the population percentage of the world's population? Like 18%. What is it? Something like,
it's getting closer to 20%, but it's a bit over 1.4 billion people.
Right.
Yeah,
so when you're looking at 10% of whatever the Indian population is, that's a lot more than the, you know, whatever population of Australia or Melbourne, you know, like it's like a big,
precisely,
you know, we got to put that into perspective as well. And that's really the work there. All right. So I think, you know, let's talk a little bit about what the theme of the book is. And I think, you know, it kind of naturally emerges from this. So you were looking at the commercialization of healthcare systems, and, you know, we're dealing with this, and now we're in this hyper commercialization aspect, not just for tourism, you know, selling trips or something, but, you know, at least in America, I mean, we're the opposite of socialized medicine. We're the opposite of all this stuff. And there's a lot of discourses about that. And we don't tend to, at least in the US, I don't think people really understand how commercial it is because it's the norm. Maybe can you just say a little bit about what you were looking at and what were you finding in general about the commercialization of healthcare around the world? I know that you were talking about that in one of the chapters.
Yeah, sure. So look, I guess even coming from a standpoint of within Australia, we have a very good public healthcare system here. So our Medicare system is, you know, the equivalent of universal health. We have our primary healthcare, secondary and tertiary, covered by the government. So it's coming from a perspective of as an Australian, looking at other more privatized countries and healthcare systems around the world. It seemed a little more odd maybe for someone from Australia than maybe from you guys in the US. But India in particular is one of the most privatized healthcare systems in the world in terms of out of pocket spending, comparatively to other nations around, or particularly developed nations around the world. The cost of treatment is very low, which is one of the things that drives medical tourism. But it wasn't always the case. So in really early on in the post-independence era, there really was a push for, you know, a social democratic version of medical healthcare within the country. But then came in the 1980s and the early 1990s, there's the strong neoliberal push internationally across healthcare systems across the world, primarily from the World Bank and the World Trade Organization, who introduced a series of structural adjustment programs in a lot of developing countries, primarily to promote the privatization of industries that had been held by governments. So in India, this happened in the early 90s, and essentially they were huge loans that the World Bank and the IMF were giving to developing countries, which really was a huge incentive for them to change a lot of their policies and privatize. And it really marketized the entire healthcare system, well, the biomedical healthcare system in particular within India, to really detrimental results, which really have escalated ever since that time. So primarily, even if we think prior to the British, there's always been really strong traditional medicine histories across India that, you know, we're talking that have been around way before biomedicine has ever even shown up, before, you know, the whole Western science. So we're talking thousands of years that these medical systems have flourished across India and done a very good job of particularly of preventative healthcare, but also primary healthcare, where it's still used quite significantly across the nation. But what has happened with these shifts and the neoliberalisation of the healthcare system is ultimately it has shifted the focus and the funding towards the biomedical system. So that really is a legacy of British colonialism within India. So there's been significant impacts on the local population. So if we think about a population of 1.4 billion people, in real terms, I haven't had a look in the last couple of years, and I know it's gotten worse since COVID, but the percentage of people who are living in what we would see as poverty is probably something upwards of 70% of the population. And so when you've got a lot of the population with very little money in a highly privatised system, it means they have very little access to healthcare. So this is one of the major things that I was interested in when I was sort of constructing this study, looking at, okay, so we've got foreigners from countries around the world who cannot get access to healthcare in their own countries for different reasons. So you guys would be well aware of a lot of whether people are not insured or underinsured in the US have started, well, there has been a massive shift of medical tourism coming from the US. So that was a growing proportion of medical tourism in India when I was doing the work there. I know it has increased since then. But even in countries like the United Kingdom, where there's always been quite a good public healthcare system there as well. But the issue there is that they have huge waiting lists. So they've under-resourced that system. So then you start getting people going out of the UK seeking cheap healthcare elsewhere. Yeah. So these are sort of the issues that I was interested in.
Yeah, I mean, and this is, it's really fascinating. I think this is something to really tease out a little bit, or to emphasize, is that, you know, tourism in general, like, forget about the global healthcare system, but tourism in general is a global sector, right? It's not just an industry. It's a collection of lots of industries that are really networked around, you know, around the world. Yeah. And what you're seeing, and this is exactly what neoliberalism does, says the person that came from the birthplace of neoliberalism in University of Chicago, is you know, this idea that, you know, you're going to have flows, right? The market's going to flow across, you know, boundaries don't matter as much anymore. And I think it's really fascinating where you look at a system like ours in the United States, or mine, like in the United States, which is very private. It could be very good if you have the money, but if you don't have the money, then there's going to be a big problem. And so you're seeing that, you know, boundaries don't matter as much. You can capitalize on this, the tourism and the flow, right? These same infrastructures that tourism utilizes to find similar healthcare with similar, we're not talking about necessarily a lower level of doctor or anything like that, you know, to in a place where you know, it doesn't cost as much, where you can actually afford it. And then that pushes out, you know, the people that are living there. It's the same thing with our global food network, right? Yeah. Especially in India as well. You know, so it's really good to put it in proportion, you know, perspective.
Yeah, and look, I mean, it's not just the patients that are flowing in and out of countries, it's also the healthcare professionals themselves. So I do have a chapter in the book where I talk about healthcare professionals and their movement in and out of countries, which I would say is another form of medical tourism from a healthcare professional perspective. So initially, a lot of the developing countries, when they were arguing that they should be promoting medical tourism, one of the arguments was that it would bring a lot of the doctors who had born in India, trained up in India, and gone and done their final training, whether it's the US, the UK, Canada. Australia, there's a lot of students who come to Australia as well. They were hoping that it would bring a lot of the doctors back into India, because ultimately there's actually more Indian doctors who are working outside of India, so qualified doctors, than there are working within India. And if we look again at the numbers, so we're talking what is it, nearly a fifth, or is it a quarter of the world's population, but all of the doctors are flowing out. And there's similar things that have been happening within the nursing industry, which I saw firsthand in one of the teaching hospitals that were teaching and training a lot of the nurses. They were trying to do retention policies or retention placements within India, but a lot of the doctors that I was talking to in the hospitals, there was still sort of this residual thing of they felt that everyone around them didn't have as great respect for them for staying in India than the doctors who have left and gone elsewhere to earn more money and to send it back. And there were a whole lot of these sorts of issues that were coming up in the context of the research, particularly when talking, I spent all my time in the hospitals, for a large percentage of my time in the hospitals.
So you're saying that the doctors who remained in India felt that they were looked on as like you couldn't cut it enough to go to a first world, whatever that kind. Yeah, that's really.
But also, the other thing is they were really quite proud that then foreigners were starting to come to their hospitals. And so they were sort of like, this medical tourism is great. So there was this sort of nationalist pride that was wrapped up in all of it as well, which I found really interesting. And look, there were certainly some doctors that were coming and nurses who were either staying in India or who had returned. One of my key informants had worked for, I think he said it was 15 to 20 years in the US and practiced there before he came back over to India, and he'd been back in India in quite senior positions.
Sure.
But also the thing is, to get them back in, they really are only going to be taking the roles in the top hospitals, the big corporate commercial hospitals, which do charge a lot more. They can charge a lot more. So it's all part of the interconnected system, which I talk about a lot in the book as well. Yeah.
Yeah, and so again, that's something that happens all across developing countries. They often talked about the brain drain in Africa and things like that, where you go off to school abroad, and the idea is that you're going to come back, and a lot of people don't. Although that is different per country to country. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's fine.
Oh, I was going to say there's other little small movements that were happening. A lot of the doctors with particular specialization would spend, full 4-day weekends flying out to, say, Dubai, where there wasn't that specialization. They'd get paid a huge amount of money. So there's that sort of short-term mobility happening as well. So all sorts of, I guess, we probably should expect that these sorts of flows are going to happen, but certainly I hadn't expected it and was quite surprised when I found out about some of these practices.
Yeah. And what, another practice too, I mean, you were talking about doctors, but you were also talking about nurses and how nurses there's a retention problem. But from what I understand in the book, I mean, that it's a little bit different. There are cultural issues as well surrounding the profession of nursing that might induce people to go abroad, right?
Yeah, look, I mean, nursing as a profession is really still very undervalued. It's still primarily, female-based, and there are significant gender imbalances in India, across all spheres and spectors. So really, nursing has been quite undervalued comparatively to, other nations. I'm assuming, look, in the US, it's probably similar to Australia, where they have quite high status. In India, they're doing more than changing bedpans, but they're not treated particularly well. Usually it's not necessarily something that the people from higher castes would be. It's not a profession people of higher castes would be involved in. It's seen as dirty work, which is quite taboo. So it's a very undervalued area. So I can absolutely understand when nurses are getting trained why they would think that it would be a better option going to other nations where they get better respect within the hospitals, get to do far more varied work practices, and much higher pay. So you can understand why that's happening. But it was also quite interesting what was happening in one of the hospitals I was working in. So essentially they were really wanting to make sure that the nurses in the hospital, because they were getting a lot of medical tourists in and were wanting to attract more people from developed countries. A lot of the medical tourism in Mumbai was still from regional nations. But so as part of the nurses' training, they were giving them deportment training and grooming, makeup training, English training, particular phrases, and I guess it got to the point where it was almost tourism style training for the nursing staff. So it was really quite fascinating, those elements as well, for the nursing professionals in India as well.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And I think maybe that gets to the point here that, let's tease out a little bit. What do we mean by medical tourism versus I guess the broader term would be like health tourism or wellness tourism. I mean, my colleague, I see she's online. Hi, Jay. She and I do a lot on wellness tourism together. What's the difference, and how do we tease out all these different kinds of travel for health and wellness purposes? Why is it tourism, instead of just travel,
Yeah. Look, I mean, I really use medical tourism as more of an umbrella term. So I really define it predominantly as international tourism across international borders. And so it incorporates mobile patients. It also incorporates the industry of medical tourism, which a lot of people, I think, particularly anthropologists who have dealt with medical tourism in the past. And also there's the definitions of biomedical tourism, and then you have your wellness tourism, which often they do intersect. But I did find, although my focus was on biomedical tourism, often people who are coming across for and it is really high tech types of medical tourism that patients are coming to India for. So, heart surgery, there's, eye LASIK surgery, knee, hip replacements. Usually the wellness tourism for those patients would be as sort of recuperation elements. So the hospitals, often the big trust hospitals that I was working in, would have, say, an entire floor that would have all of the different Ayush options available as sort of a recuperation part for tourists at the end of their treatment as a recovery option. But certainly if you look at different areas of India, there's far more wellness, or what would you think of as wellness tourism. So down in Goa, where I spent a little bit of time at one point, there's quite a lot of wellness tourism down there. So whether we're talking about yoga or more broadly, the 5 traditional Ayush areas of medicine. But as I said, I really was focusing on the biomedical, because that really is kind of, I guess, where a lot of the bigger scale policies and where the money and the power was sort of being driven in through the country. So that's really where I sort of threw my attention in these hospitals. And that was the attention of the hospitals more so, with the, I guess, the wellness tourism as an added on benefit at the end,
I mean, did they do touristic for some of these patients? I mean, were they coupling this with some touristic activities? I mean, they're going to go visit the Taj Mahal if they...
Really?
Not really?
I mean, look, there's also quite a bit of dental tourism in India. So people who are coming to get their teeth done, yes, maybe. There were a lot of packages that were being offered by medical tourism companies, which are really kind of brokers, often in developed countries, but also sometimes through. I've met with a whole lot of medical tourism agency representatives who were operating through the different hospitals that I was working in. And they do offer tourism packages, medical tourism packages, which will incorporate all of the hospital elements, so the biomedical, but then we'll have the jungle safari at the end, or whatever it happens to be. Go to the beach or do the triangle. So that definitely was becoming more of an advertising ploy, I would say, for these intermediaries who were trying to sell these package deals. So their tie-ins with the hospitals were really quite integral. All of the hospitals that I worked in, maybe one didn't, but most of them had tie-ups with, 5 or 6 of these different medical tourism companies in different locations around the world. And a lot of when I have spoken to people working within these agencies, they often kind of pitch it as they're trying to do the best thing for the patient. So they're going to the hospitals with the best accreditation. They're in making sure that, even though regulation in the country might not be okay, they're, making sure that the hospitals have the Harvard stamp of approval, or the hospitals have there's a whole range of different accreditation systems that go along with it as well. And so they pitch it as, we're protecting you as the consumer.
Yeah.
So it very much is a consumer-based thing. So I don't know. There's a whole lot of interesting elements in there, which I also talk about in the book quite significantly.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things you talk about in the book, and I know Amy Spear talks about it in her book on IVF tourism and everything, and what I've seen myself, having gone through 2 different medical systems. I'm a dual citizen with Italy, and my one kid was born in Italy, one was born in America, so it was very interesting to compare that. And in the US, especially if let's say you're pregnant, you're giving birth, I mean, you get to choose your room and like, what do you want? And it's very, I mean, in a way, it's very similar to like, a hotel that you're choosing for tourism. Whereas in some of these, public health facilities, I remember going into the hospital for our first son when my wife was pregnant. We were like wandering around the maternity ward, and they're like, "What are you doing in here?" And whoa, we're supposed to meet with somebody to choose the rooms. They're like, "When you're giving birth, then you come back. Like, you're getting whatever we have, And but I mean, that kind of mentality of consumer, I guess they often sell their rooms and their facilities in much the same way, that you would be selling a hotel, right?
Well, yes, there's the presidential suites in some of these
Yes,
hospitals, there's concierge services at the door. There's, these big sort of palatial open,
right.
entrances
It looks
to
like
the
a
buildings.
Taj, brand
Yeah,
hotel.
very much so. I mean, some of them were kind of a bit gobsmacking that they were a hospital at all. So
Right.
you've got these massive sort of palatial, harking back to the Raj palaces from the outside, marble and columns and all sorts of things. And you go in and, the ceilings are higher than you've seen anywhere. And there's columns and there's like, it just is opulence.
Yeah.
But also with this, but internally, they've got these really high, they promote, we've got the best biotech in the country. And they're all, using the most upgraded tech, because we also know that tech is a big industry with huge, IT is a huge industry within India as well. So, and that, obviously in the healthcare system, a lot of that tech gets used within these hospitals, but at a very high cost also.
Oh, yeah.
So there's all of these elements, but also, I also spent time in some of the smaller hospitals and the hospitals that were underfunded. So what are known as nursing hospitals in India. So secondary hospitals. I did have meetings with some of the surgeons who I guess have placements in all sorts of different hospitals. One of my first interviews with one of my participants in the study, he got me, I basically organised a meeting with him online, was introduced through one of my other informants, middle of the night in a taxi, going across Mumbai, going, where on earth am I going? And turn up to this, I knew I was going to a hospital, but just didn't know which one or the context. Of only, had only been in the city for maybe 2 or 3 weeks. And so we drive into this very small, maybe it was a 4-story hospital. Out the front, there was a big gated courtyard. And there's about 100 people sort of milling around in the front, and obviously not wealthy people. So, and sort of on talking to some of the people in the hospital, they generally, there's, 50 to 100 people sitting out there waiting. They may be family members of patients, or they may be patients themselves waiting to get treatment. This hospital in particular, although it was fee paying, it was a very, very small fee paying. But often people will just come and stay. Like, so they'll come in from rural areas or, other areas around Mumbai, and will just camp out in what was literally a car park for days on end waiting for treatment. So then you go in, I went into this hospital, sort of trying to find this doctor, got ushered up into this rickety old lift, go up to, 3rd or 4th floor, sort of ushered in, put in all gowned up in surgical gear. I'm like, what is happening here? Go in, and there's basically maybe about 6 to 8 beds around this massive open room that was a very old building, and sort of, looked like milk cans, tins hanging off the beds, and open surgery going on in all of these beds. And it was quite an interesting entree to my research. But, the stark contrast between that and then going into these, beautifully fitted out, opulent 5-star hotel looking hospitals where, you know, you get shown around and there's the gymnasium on this level and the swimming pool and the yoga retreat for afterwards. And it is absolutely stark. I mean, the medical tourism suites, which often are separate, the international suites are often separate to the rest of the suites in the hospitals. They'll have, you know, some of them have 2 bedrooms, so the medical tourists can have a traveller staying with them in a hospital. There'll sometimes be kitchenette facilities, there'll be widescreen TVs, there'll be internet facilities. So that stark contrast was just kind of gobsmacking. And also within some of these hospitals that were also not-for-profits, they maintain their status as not-for-profits because they have, under legislation, they should be providing 20% of their beds to, I guess, the lower classes and castes, the way that they're classified within India. But I can tell you that not all of them had full beds, and, you know, the more you talk to different people, a lot of the hospitals, there'll be a back door for people to enter. People in the region won't know that is available. There's quite a complex process of going through the social worker within the hospitals to get access, and it is really not very well monitored. So, I mean, I've written up a little bit of that in the book as well, but it's really quite problematic, particularly for the bigger, newer hospitals. But a lot of these not-for-profits are operating significantly like corporate hospitals, but still getting these not-for-profit benefits. Right. So it's really, really problematic.
So what do you think, you know, as you're talking, I mean, there's so many other questions, right? And we don't have a ton of time. So if anybody wants to put questions in the Q&A, now's the time to do it. But, you know, we talk often about tourism in general is, oftentimes is predicated on this idea of engagement with otherness, right? You know, you not just an other, like a different racial or other, ethnic other, or historical other, but also the other in us, you know, our own selves. And you could play out kind of fantasies of being, you know, something else. One of the things I've always noticed in going to India on tourism, leading trips, I was a tour operator, or in Southeast Asia, is that there's so many colonial style you know, facilities and hotels that are still built, new ones that are built in that colonial style, so that you can play out, especially the white person, right, can play out this kind of like the old British and French, you know, colonial psyche. You know, you could be the Indiana Jones, and you know, do you think that that's a motivating factor for choosing these kinds of, besides the money, of course, but like, you know, is that something that's going on there, you think, when you get to go these palatial, like a Raj kind of site?
Look, I do think that is an element of it, but I also think that it's, you know, a local element for, I guess, the wealthier within Indian society. There is a growing middle to upper class, but also the top, you know, 5% of the population in terms of wealth are very, very wealthy. And we might think 5% in Australia, that's not very many people, but it's a lot of people in India, if you're thinking 5% of 1.4 billion people. And I think there is something, you see it in sort of the stratification across particularly urban cities, in the way that whether it's apartment buildings are built. There's something about the palatial nature that certainly appeals to both the higher caste and the higher class. There is a breakdown of the castes happening. That's still very firmly in place. But I think as people are moving up that strata through, I guess, social mobility, socioeconomic mobility up through the strata, that idea of being embedded in the Raja's palace is also an element.
Right.
But also, you know, if they're going to visit Rajasthan, someone from Maharashtra, they want to go and stay in the Taj-looking palace hotel. But similarly for the hospitals that cater to the medical tourists and the rich of the nation. So I'd say there's a comparison between both. Yeah,
absolutely. And that is something that you also obviously I noticed too when you go to India, the stark difference between the haves and the have not. Sorry, I was looking at some of the questions. Let's see. The other thing I was going to, a follow-up would be this idea, you know, Amy talks about this as well in her IVF tourism studies is that there's often a competition, right? Like the tourism aspect is embedded in there because these hospitals are competing against one another as well for attracting patients, let's say. And so whatever is the best amenities, I mean, obviously who has Harvard, on their resume, but with best amenities, best location, right? So that you can do some tourism when you're there, would be maybe the one that wins out in some of those preferences. Is that something that also is present?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, the hospitals that I were in, the ones that were more aggressively going after medical tourists to come into the hospitals, one of them was situated in, I guess, really the only gated entire suburb that was in Mumbai at the time.
Mhm.
It was all relatively new. It had only been built within 10 years. It looks, I think I write about this example in the book. It just doesn't look like the rest of Mumbai. Like it's got these wide streets, everything's clean. There's, gardens everywhere. There's a lake in the middle of it that is actually a really lovely, clean lake. There's barely any beggars on the street, which is really uncommon around the rest of Mumbai. I think they get moved on.
Yeah.
And a lot of the international expats all live in that suburb as well. So it's a hub of international expats. And that hospital is working in actually seem to have the highest level of Western or developed country medical tourists coming in there. They get off the plane in Mumbai, get driven in a very nice car straight to this very nice suburb. Wouldn't really see the rest of what's going on. Well, in the drive, you'll see it in the drive from the airport to the suburb, but you're ensconced in a high socioeconomic geospatial structure. So I mean, that's one of the elements. There's also, I guess, the sort of niche branding that different hospitals have, or not necessarily branding, but there's different hospitals that have different religious backgrounds, so they'll offer particular things that may appeal to people from different religions. That's another niche sort of area that other hospitals market to. There's a whole range of different things that hospitals do.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So I've called up my colleague as well, Jayan, who basically was going to ask a similar question I was going to kind of end with, which is about your thesis, I think, of the book, basically, right? So Jay, you wanna ask the question?
Yeah, thank you so much, Michael, and thank you so much, Kristen. It's been so interesting listening to you. And it's really interesting how this is really paralleling and similar to Michael and our research on wellness tourism in Bali. All these, tourists from Western developed countries, they are picked up by really luxury cars, go to this 5-star resort and do all this mindfulness and things, and come back to London. So it seems very similar, creating tourist bubbles. And there's a really high levels of economic leakages there. But I was gonna ask, all these packages for medical tourism in India, are they organized by local companies or Western companies? And since the Indian government or India can harness this demand in a sustainable or positive way, what would be a way to use or harness this growing demand for their local economy?
Yeah, look, I mean, there's both. There's local medical tourism companies, but I think probably the international ones are a bit more successful than the local ones. Although, look, I had this described to me by multiple people in different hospitals in the higher ends of the hospital administration, talking about their frustration of India's inability to attract tourism at the rates that they wanted to, or international tourism. So, they talked a lot about, whether it was language barriers, although, a lot of people, particularly in these hospitals, are all English speakers, which is where they're trying to attract English speakers predominantly, but also a lot from across Asia. But they described as it's not a culture that is an easy fit with tourism like other places may be. So I got that explanation quite frequently. But yeah, as I said, a lot of the in-place medical tourism companies that are situated in the places of where tourists are coming from often seem to work a lot better. Hospitals were also working with other governments, really, to sort of set up structures. So, I mean, I sort of question the promotion and ongoing promotion of medical tourism in the country, particularly if we're thinking about how many people in the population are underserviced, have no access to healthcare, have no access to tertiary healthcare. I really think it's a little morally problematic and quite repugnant to be saying we're just going to keep opening more hospitals for international patients who, you know, on a relative scale, are far more wealthy. Even if their own country they cannot afford their healthcare, they're far more wealthy than, you know, the people, 30% of Indians living in slums who can't access healthcare, who are lining up for a week in these secondary hospitals and saving up for 10 years to get procedures done. So, I mean, in terms of the thesis, look, there is a lot more that could be done if India wanted to expand the trade. But really, I think there needs to be a lot more resource development that goes directly to the citizens of India to give them more equitable access to healthcare in the same way that other tourists are coming there to get access for it. You know, look at what's going on at home before you try and bring people from abroad would be my answer to that.
Right, right. And you know, there's somebody who was anonymous who asked this question, but it goes right into this, right? They said one part of the book talks about how the media skews our perception, or, you know, our being the general public, of the benefits of medical tourism in India. And do you think that this is a strategy of the government and the governments of people who benefit from the commodification of healthcare?
Absolutely is. Absolutely is. It's that old neoliberal economic trickle-down theory that gets promoted everywhere. You know, if we bring in foreign dollars, it'll trickle down and everyone will benefit. But we know, I mean, that's been proven over decades. It's long ago. We know that governments and financial and economists will still sort of play that trumpet on and on, but we know it doesn't work. And in this instance, you can see it playing out really clearly that those benefits do not actually line the pockets of anyone than the people who are the big corporates generally. And look, there are a lot of I write a bit about this in the book as well. A lot of the big corporates who are based in India who are making an awful lot of money off this trade, huge amounts of money, billions and billions of dollars off this sort of trade, yet are still getting, through different loopholes, still getting tax benefits from the government. So I think we really need to think quite carefully when, you know, you're getting parroted, oh, it's helpful to go in, you're bringing your foreign dollars into developing economies, but it really, what it does is sort of skew the priorities. You know, as I said, there are masses of people who have no access or such little access to healthcare and are dying of still, you know, communicable diseases at rates that are unlike anywhere in the world. So, you know, that's my answer to that.
Yeah.
So beware of that trumpet playing.
Right. You know, but one other thing, I'm going to play devil's advocate for just a second, and we don't have much time left, but we know that India has had such a sophisticated health and wellness system. We're talking about what we would dub Ayurvedic or, you know, like alternative non-biomedical health systems. Do people ever say, well, look, the locals can just continue doing it this way, and we're using medicine for those who subscribe to biomedical or cosmopolitan medicine? Do you get that at all? Do you say, well, you know, let them do the way that they've always been treating their health conditions? And obviously something must be working because it's the biggest population in the world, you know.
True. I don't know. I didn't hear that much from the biomedical doctors and hospital administrators. But I guess, look, if you think about it structurally, that's kind of what the government have left the population. I mean, as you said, it is very effective. But also I found a lot of the local population, because they couldn't go to the doctors often, and you can get access to any sort of pharmaceuticals on the street corner. I met actually a guy from the US who was over there buying up a big stash of Viagra to take back that he was then going to on-sell illegally at home. I don't know how he's getting it back, but elements like that. So people, instead of going to the doctor will go and purchase medicine that they don't know anything about. There's very little public, knowledge of any sorts of what medicines work. Some of the people who asked me different questions, assuming that I was a doctor, I don't know, because I was going into hospitals, etc.
Sure.
Very little health knowledge. And when there's availability of pharmaceuticals on the street corner, they go, oh, but my friend took that, so I'm just going to go and get that, because they still have to pay for the traditional medicine.
Yeah.
To go and see the traditional medical doctors. It's still not free. It's a much smaller charge. But for things like some, particularly, I guess, when people are in chronic stages of disease, a lot of the traditional medicines, as I said, are often far better suited to preventative healthcare. Brilliant.
Yeah, right.
Far better than biomedicine. But when it gets to this end of stage disease, whether we're thinking, and the benefits of antibiotics, think about that.
Right.
But also with surgical procedures and things like that, there's very little in the traditional medical systems that deal with that sort of end of disease. So, I mean, we can say all good and well, but essentially, if you think about life expectancy is always going to be much, much lower. So anyway, these equity things all play out, and the government are obviously saying, well, we'll leave them to what has been working for thousands of years, but we'll just give the rich people access to the other stuff. It's pretty unbalanced.
Right. Yeah, no, absolutely. I agree. I'm just thinking are there alternate, I mean, this is off topic a little bit, but in terms of bartering, one thing that I think people draw, like for spiritual healers in West Africa, for example, we're just doing an exhibition on that. And one of the things we're seeing here is that sometimes they're preferred, the alternate healers, because you can pay through bartering, right? Like my child can clean your house for a week to get some of this. Is that something that also occurs or not? Or is that specific to another?
I was about to say, maybe it happens more in regional areas where there's, maybe only
rural areas,
minimal access. Yeah, not so much. Well, not that I saw or heard of in the urban centres. Well, not in Mumbai, and none of the other urban centres. I didn't hear anything about that. No.
Yeah. Well, great. Well, we're almost out of time, but I have one other question. It's from somebody anonymous, but it said, how do you find out if you want to go into anthropology? And I thought that's a great question to end. You're talking to two different kinds of anthropologists here that have converged. Yeah. I mean, I'm a cultural anthropologist, works in, with archaeologists a lot, and you're a medical anthropologist. So you have that biological anthropology as well as cultural. What do you think? How do you find out? How do you discern your calling here?
Well, I don't know. I guess it's different for everyone, but isn't it always what you find the most interesting? So, I mean, anthropology, whether we're talking about cultural anthropology, medical anthropology, social anthropology, it's such a holistic discipline. And there are so many different subfields within the fields. If you read this book, a lot of the work I do is critical medical anthropology, which is a subfield then of medical anthropology. So I think it's about reading broadly and working out what interests you the most. And that's probably the path that you're going to want to go down. It certainly was the case for me. Yeah.
Right. I think, I'll just give a plug for anthropology because we have to do this a lot in our very neoliberal university system, is that we're not the most popular discipline anymore because it's often perceived as not being a pre-professional kind of discipline, but really any social science, but certainly anthropology with such a holistic kind of approach to things. You could be a quantitative or qualitative researcher. You could look at medicine or traditions and rituals or archaeology or whatever, or linguistics. I think what it does is it prepares you for dealing with people. It prepares you for understanding how people tick, for thinking critically, like you said too, Kristen, about something. That was the thing that really opened my eyes. I went to a pre-professional program in diplomacy for an undergrad, and then when I did anthropology, I was like, oh my God, not everybody thinks in rational choice, and not everybody, it opens your mind a little bit,
Yeah, absolutely. Changes your worldview in so many different ways. And look, it's such a great place that we can actually explore different worlds and the way that people live differently all over the place. If like my particular interest is looking at equity across the world, and that happens in so many different variations, in different contexts, in different, you know, cultures and groups. It's such a wide variety that you can actually look at in anthropology. I bring all of my students in and they end up in PhDs with me.
That's right. And I'm sure if you're interested, if anybody here, you know, is interested in reaching out, certainly you can reach out to me. You know, it's my name, michael@DeGiovanni.com. I'm sure Kristen as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm Kristen S at unimelb.edu.au.
Great. Well, thank you. The book, once again, is Medical Tourism and Inequality in India. It's a fascinating, really fascinating look at how, you know, tourism kind of gives that imbalance, right, between the haves and the have-nots, but on a very global scale, even though it's instantiated in one particular area or one particular nation. I mean, it's a fascinating read, and I'm so pleased that it's in the series, and come and buy the book. So,
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Kristen, so much for being here today. And you know, hope to talk to you again soon.
Yeah, thanks, Michael, and thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely.